The rain that afternoon was a fine, freezing drizzle that settled onto my shoulders and clung to the wool of my sensible beige coat. I stood at the bottom of the grand limestone steps of Oak Ridge Country Club, the cold seeping through my shoes. In my arms, wrapped carefully in protective plastic, I held a folded cashmere baby blanket. It was an intricate ivory lattice pattern. I spent 6 months knitting it, letting the soft yarn slide through my fingers while thinking about the new life entering our family. Now, the plastic beaded with icy rain, and my hands were completely numb. Standing at the top of those steps, blocking the heavy frosted glass doors, was my sister. She wore a tailored maternity dress that cost more than my first car, a diamond tennis bracelet catching the dull gray light, and an expression of utter disdain. The frosted glass behind her glowed with warm golden light. I could hear the muffled sounds of a jazz trio and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. I smelled the rich aroma of catered food mingling with the damp earth. It was an extravagant $50,000 celebration. For a baby I was apparently unfit to be near. She looked down at me, her eyes sweeping over my damp coat and the practical leather purse slung over my shoulder. There was a time when she would have run down those steps to shield me from the rain. I raised her from the time she was 5 years old. I packed her lunches, braided her hair, and paid her college tuition with the quiet, steady devotion of a mother. I protected our family assets, ensuring she never knew a day of financial worry. Now she looked at me as if I were a trespasser wandering onto private property. "You cannot come inside looking like that, Eleanor," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, hushed whisper so the valet would not hear. "Just look at yourself. You are dripping wet. You are a mess." I held out the package, my voice steady despite the tightness in my throat. "I brought the blanket, the one I made for the baby. I just wanted to bring it in." She did not reach for it. She crossed her arms over her expensive dress, shielding her bump as if my very presence were a contagion. "No. Absolutely not. Richard and his parents are in there. Half the board of directors is in there. I told them you were not coming because you have not been feeling well." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with a familiar, practiced cruelty. "I am not having you wander around embarrassing me in front of my new family with your confused little episodes. You have been slipping lately. We both know it. Your mind is declining. You are becoming a liability." The lie was so smooth, polished. She had been laying the groundwork for this narrative for months. The subtle gaslighting, the insistence that I was misplacing documents, the condescending pats on my hand when I asked perfectly reasonable questions about our joint accounts. She was building a cage out of my age, painting me as a frail, declining old woman who could no longer be trusted with her own checkbook, let alone the family trust. "I am perfectly fine," I said quietly. The wind whipped a strand of wet gray hair across my cheek. "I came to celebrate." "Well, you are not celebrating in here," she snapped. She gestured sharply toward the street, her manicured nails a flash of crimson in the gray afternoon. "Go wait in that dirty pub across the street until we are finished. Order a tea or something. When the shower is over and the family has gone home, I will come find you. Do not make a scene, Eleanor. Just do as I say." She turned her back on me, pulling open the heavy frosted glass door. Warm light spilled out onto the wet pavement for just a second, bringing with it the sound of laughter and expensive perfume. Before the door clicked firmly shut behind her, she banished me. The woman I raised, the woman I gave my life to, had just exiled me to a greasy tavern in the rain, so I would not spoil the aesthetics of her stolen luxury. I stood there for a long moment, the icy rain soaking through my collar. I looked down at the handmade cashmere blanket, the intricate stitches representing hours of love and anticipation, now heavy and meaningless in my cold hands. I looked at the grand doors of the country club. I felt a tremble in my hands, but it was not from the cold, and it was certainly not from sorrow. It was the adrenaline of absolute clarity. I nodded to the empty steps. I lowered my head, letting my shoulders slump just enough to complete the picture of the meek, defeated old woman she believed me to be. I turned away from the golden light and walked slowly down the limestone steps, heading toward the street. As I walked, I adjusted the strap of my leather purse. It felt incredibly heavy against my hip, and for good reason. My mind was not slipping. My memory was not declining. I spent 40 years as a forensic accountant, auditing corporate fraud and tracing hidden assets. I see everything. I document everything. Beneath the folded umbrella inside that heavy purse rested a thick envelope containing 70 pages of undeniable legal documentation. It held the forged wire transfers, the hidden accounts, and the final judicial injunctions required to instantly freeze every stolen asset paying for the caviar inside. Clara thought she had just sent a confused old woman into the rain. She did not realize she had just given me the exact window of time I needed to completely destroy her life. I stepped off the wet curb, heading toward the pub, and finally allowed myself to smile. My name is Eleanor. I am 68 years old. And before I finally retired, I spent 4 decades working as a senior forensic accountant. I spent my entire adult life meticulously dismantling complex financial frauds, exposing arrogant corporate executives who foolishly thought they could hide their insatiable greed behind dummy shell companies, and forged signatures on banking documents. I was very good at my demanding, high-pressure job. I knew exactly how to find the missing pennies that unraveled millions of dollars in corporate theft. Yet, none of that vast professional experience fully prepared me for the devastating reality of being targeted in my very own home by the one person I trusted most. We are often taught from a young age to fear the desperate stranger in the dark alley, the anonymous scammer on the telephone, or the unseen computer hacker trying to breach our retirement accounts in the middle of the night. But the truth, the cold and heartbreaking truth, that many of us only learn when it is much too late, is that the cruelest financial betrayals rarely come from the outside. They come from the people sitting right at our own dining tables. They come from the loved ones who look at our gray hair and conveniently mistake it for a fading mind. They look at our lifelong devotion, our endless patience, and see only an easy opportunity to take what they falsely believe they are owed. My younger sister Clara looked at me and saw a frail, forgetful older woman who was supposedly no longer capable of managing the family estate. She mistook my quiet, peaceful nature for blind compliance and my age for total incompetence. She built an elaborate, cruel trap to silence me and steal everything I had worked my entire life to protect. But before I tell you exactly how I took that vicious trap and turned it into her absolute legal and financial undoing, I want to ask you to take a brief moment to connect with me. Please pause this video right now and go down to the comment section below. Tell me what city or country you are tuning in from today. More importantly, I want you to share your own personal stories with me. Tell me if you have ever had your quiet generosity mistaken for weakness by someone you loved dearly. Tell me if you have ever been treated like a disposable burden by the very people you spent your entire life supporting and protecting. We simply do not talk about this specific kind of agonizing elder betrayal nearly enough, and I truly believe there is immense profound healing power in knowing that we are not standing out in the cold rain completely alone. Because long before I became the discarded older woman standing out in the freezing drizzle, clutching a ruined, handmade cashmere baby blanket, I was just a devoted, loving sister who was desperately trying to hold the fragile pieces of a deeply broken family together. Our parents were a remarkable, deeply loving couple who built a successful local hardware supply business from the ground up, but they were never planners. They lived entirely in the present moment, driven by a spontaneous, chaotic joy that filled our childhood home with laughter, but left very little room for practical foresight. I was born when they were in their early 20s, a serious, quiet child who preferred organizing the pantry over playing in the mud. By the time I was 35, I was already deeply entrenched in my career as a forensic accountant, living a quiet, meticulously ordered life in a small apartment downtown. I was unmarried, dedicated to my work, and completely content with the predictable rhythm of ledgers, audits, and corporate financial reviews. And then, defying all medical odds and completely upending the quiet equilibrium of our family, my mother gave birth to Clara. Clara was a miracle baby, arriving when my parents were well into their 50s. The age gap between us was exactly 30 years. When she was born, I stood in the hospital room, looking down at this tiny, squalling infant, feeling less like an older sister and more like a bewildered aunt. I did not immediately know how to fit this delicate new life into my structured world, but my parents were utterly transformed by her arrival. They doted on her with an intensity that bordered on worship, pouring every ounce of their remaining energy into her happiness. For 5 beautiful golden years, Clara was the absolute center of their universe. She was a bright, vivacious child, completely enveloped in a bubble of unconditional adoration. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November, that golden bubble violently burst. My parents were driving home from a weekend trip to the coast when a commercial delivery truck lost control on a slick curve and crossed the center line. The police officer who knocked on my apartment door that evening spoke in a low, measured voice, delivering the words that would permanently fracture my life into a before and an after. They were gone, both of them, instantly. I was 35 years old, standing in the doorway of my apartment, trying to process the sudden catastrophic destruction of my family. I did not have time to grieve. I did not have time to fall apart or lose myself in the agonizing pain of their absence. Because sitting in the waiting room of the local precinct, clutching a stuffed rabbit and waiting for parents who were never coming back, was 5-year-old Clara, the decision was not even a decision. It was an absolute biological and moral imperative. The state child welfare workers gently suggested placing her with a temporary foster family while the estate was sorted out, noting that a single career-driven woman might struggle to raise a traumatized kindergartner. I politely but firmly showed them the door. I packed up my quiet, immaculate downtown apartment, broke my lease, and moved back into my parents' sprawling, echoey house in the suburbs. I became a mother overnight. The early days were a blur of profound grief and steep learning curves. Clara was devastated, her small world completely shattered by the sudden disappearance of the 2 people who loved her most. She would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, terrified of the dark, crying out for our mother. I would sit beside her small bed for hours, stroking her hair, humming the lullabies. I vaguely remembered our mother singing to me 3 decades prior. I learned how to braid hair, pack nutritious school lunches, and navigate the complex social politics of the elementary school playground. I reduced my hours at the accounting firm, sacrificing the partnership track I had worked so hard for, because this little girl needed a steady, immovable anchor in a world that had suddenly proven to be horribly unpredictable. It was during those agonizing, sleepless first few months that I remembered the blanket. Our grandmother, a stern but deeply loving woman who immigrated from Scotland, had a traditional knitting pattern she brought over with her. It was a complex, beautiful ivory lattice design, incredibly difficult to master, requiring a meticulous attention to detail that perfectly suited my analytical mind. She had knitted one for me when I was born, and it remained folded in the bottom of my cedar chest for decades. I went to the finest yarn shop in the city and purchased the softest, highest quality cashmere I could find. For the next 2 months, whenever Clara finally fell into a fitful sleep, I sat in the rocking chair by her window and knitted. The repetitive, rhythmic clicking of the needles became my own form of therapy, a quiet, productive meditation in a house heavy with sorrow. I poured every ounce of my unspoken grief and my fierce, protective love into those stitches. When I finally finished the blanket, I wrapped it around Clara on a particularly cold evening. She pulled the soft cashmere up to her chin, burying her tear-stained face in the warm ivory lattice. For the first time since the accident, she slept completely through the night. From that day forward, that blanket became her shield. She carried it everywhere. It dragged on the floor behind her as she walked through the kitchen. It accompanied her to the doctor's office. It sat on her lap during every movie night. It was the physical manifestation of my promise to her that she was safe, she was loved, and I would absolutely never let her fall. While I nurtured her emotional recovery with cashmere and patience, my professional instincts immediately took over the massive, chaotic task of securing her future. My parents, bless their joyful hearts, were notoriously terrible at managing money. When I finally sat down at the heavy oak desk in my father's study and began auditing their estate, I was horrified. The hardware business was profitable, but the books were a disaster of commingled funds, unpaid invoices, and undocumented handshake loans. There was no formal will, no established trust, and a terrifying amount of outstanding debt tied to the family home. For a forensic accountant, looking at that chaotic ledger was like looking at a deeply infected wound. I went to work with a ruthless, surgical precision. I spent my evenings and weekends untangling years of financial mismanagement. I negotiated with creditors, restructured the business debt, and eventually sold the hardware company to a regional competitor for a highly favorable sum. I took every single penny from the sale, paid off the mortgage on the house, and placed the remaining capital into a meticulously structured, high-yield family trust. I made myself the sole executor and trustee, a decision made out of absolute necessity to protect the assets from probate and unnecessary taxation. My goal was simple and singular. Clara would never have to worry about money. Ever, as she grew from a fragile child into a confident, vibrant teenager, the trust quietly funded every aspect of her affluent life. I paid for elite private schools where she rubbed elbows with the children of surgeons and politicians. I funded expensive private violin lessons, elite summer camps in the mountains, and a year abroad in Paris that broadened her horizons. I drove a sensible 10-year-old sedan so I could afford to buy her a brand new luxury vehicle for her 16th birthday. I wore the same 3 practical suits to work so she could have the latest designer dresses for her school dances. I never resented the sacrifices, not for a single second. I viewed my careful stewardship of our family assets as the ultimate expression of my love. Some mothers express their devotion through physical affection or effusive praise. I expressed mine through balanced ledgers, guaranteed compound interest, and an impenetrable financial safety net. I wanted to give her the world, and I used my professional expertise to ensure she had the capital to explore it. I kept the records pristine, documenting every withdrawal and every investment, maintaining the trust with the same rigorous ethical standards I applied to my corporate audits. Clara blossomed into a stunningly beautiful, highly intelligent, and fiercely independent young woman. She had our mother's infectious laugh and our father's effortless charisma. She was entirely accustomed to a life of frictionless comfort. The financial safety net I had built was so effective, so invisible, that she simply took it for granted, the way one takes gravity for granted. She never had to balance a checkbook, never had to sweat over a utility bill, and never experienced the terrifying panic of an overdrawn account. I paid for her undergraduate degree at a prestigious private university in full, in cash. When she decided she wanted to open a boutique interior design firm after graduation, I carefully reviewed her business plan, pointed out the logistical flaws, helped her refine the financial projections, and then released the startup capital from the trust. I was so proud of her. I watched her stand in the center of her new sunlit studio, surrounded by expensive fabric swatches and architectural blueprints, and I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I had successfully guided her through the darkest tragedy imaginable and delivered her safely into a bright, prosperous adulthood. But as she entered her late 20s, the dynamic between us began to undergo a slow, almost imperceptible shift. The absolute dependence of her childhood gradually morphed into a subtle, simmering resentment of my authority. Because I was the trustee, every major financial request still had to cross my desk. If she wanted to buy a commercial property or upgrade her business equipment, she had to present the request to me. I never said no without a very good reason, but I always asked questions. I wanted to see the return on investment. I wanted to see the risk assessment. I was an accountant, so it was simply my nature to protect the principal. Clara began to view my meticulous oversight not as a loving protective measure, but as an annoying paternalistic restriction. She would roll her eyes when I asked for receipts. She would sigh heavily when I requested the quarterly profit and loss statements for her business. She started making offhand, passive-aggressive comments about how I was choking her creativity with my endless spreadsheets. She felt entitled to the money, viewing it as her inherent birthright rather than a carefully cultivated resource that required active management and immense respect. The tension escalated significantly when she met Richard. Richard was the heir to a very prominent, highly leveraged, status-obsessed family that made their fortune in commercial real estate development. He was polished, handsome, and carried himself with the arrogant swagger of a man who had never been told no. His family belonged to the Oak Ridge Country Club. They summered in the Hamptons, and they communicated their worth entirely through ostentatious displays of wealth. From the moment I met Richard, my professional instincts flared. He wore an expensive Swiss watch, but had terrible posture when the bill arrived at dinner. He drove a leased sports car and talked loudly about his investments, but used financial terminology incorrectly. He was, to my trained eye, a man desperate to appear wealthier than he actually was. I simply did not trust him at all. Clara, however, was completely intoxicated by him. She was dazzled by the glamorous lifestyle his family projected, and she threw herself entirely into winning their approval. She started dressing differently, abandoning her unique bohemian style for stiff, expensive designer labels that matched his mother's demanding aesthetic. She began attending endless charity galas and exclusive luncheons, desperately trying to seamlessly integrate herself into his affluent social circle. As her engagement to Richard approached, her demands on the trust became significantly larger and much more frequent. She wanted a larger apartment in a more prestigious neighborhood. She needed an entirely new wardrobe. She requested a massive sum for a country club initiation fee. I approved most of these requests, wanting her to be happy, but I drew the line firmly when she asked me to liquidate a substantial portion of our safest dividend-yielding blue-chip stocks to invest in one of Richard's highly speculative commercial real estate ventures. I sat her down in my kitchen, poured her a cup of tea, and calmly explained why it was a terrible financial decision. I showed her the risk models. I pointed out the glaring holes in Sneered's prospectus. I told her, gently but firmly, that as the trustee, I had a fiduciary duty to protect the assets, and I could not authorize throwing family money into a high-risk vanity project. She was furious. She stood up. Her face flushed and accused me of being a jealous, bitter old woman who wanted to sabotage her happiness. She told me I was completely out of touch, that I did not understand how modern wealth was built, and that I was using the trust as a weapon to maintain control over her adult life. It was the first time she had ever spoken to me with such raw, venomous disrespect. It broke my heart, but I held my ground. I absolutely refused to sign the release document. The money stayed exactly where it was safely invested. We did not speak for a month after that argument. It was the longest silence between us in 30 years. I missed her terribly. I missed her bright laugh, her rapid-fire text messages, and our Sunday morning coffee dates. I spent the month reviewing the trust documents, questioning my own judgment, wondering if I was being too rigid. But the numbers simply did not lie. Richard's project was a financial sinkhole, and I had done my job. I had properly protected her. Then, on a crisp afternoon in early October, the silence was finally broken. She showed up at my front door unannounced, carrying a beautiful bouquet of my favorite white hydrangeas and a small, beautifully wrapped box. She looked radiant. The anger and resentment that had darkened her eyes for months were completely gone, replaced by a soft, glowing joy. She handed me the small box, tears welling in her eyes. I untied the silk ribbon and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a pristine bavish paper, was a tiny pair of white knitted booties and a sonogram photograph. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. All the terrible tension, all the bitter arguments, and all the lingering resentment instantly evaporated, washed away by a profound, overwhelming wave of pure joy. I pulled her into a tight embrace, crying into her shoulder as she laughed and hugged me back tightly. She was pregnant. I was going to be a great aunt, though in my heart I felt like I was about to become a grandmother. I forgave her instantly. The love I had for her was too deep, too foundational to let a foolish financial argument keep us apart. We spent the rest of the afternoon sitting on my back porch, drinking decaffeinated tea, looking at the sonogram, and talking excitedly about nursery colors and baby names. It felt as though the dark clouds had finally parted, and our golden relationship was completely restored. That very evening, after she drove back to the city, I went up to the dusty attic and opened my old cedar chest. I dug past the winter sweaters and the spare linens until I found the original ivory lattice pattern our grandmother had brought over from Scotland. I laid the faded, yellowed paper out on my kitchen table, tracing the complex stitches with my fingertip. The next morning I went back to the same fine yarn shop I had visited 30 years prior. I purchased the highest quality cashmere they carried, ensuring it was identical in texture and color to the yarn I had used for Clara's childhood blanket. I wanted this new blanket to be a perfect continuation of our legacy. I wanted to weave my deep love, my protection, and my immense joy into every single stitch, passing the beautiful tradition down to the next generation. I cast the first row onto my knitting needles that night, sitting in my quiet living room, feeling a profound sense of peace. I began the intricate, painstaking work of building the lattice pattern, completely unaware that while I was happily knitting a symbol of our enduring family bond, the daughter I had raised was already carefully laying the groundwork for a betrayal, so deeply calculated and immensely devastating that it would shatter my entire world all over again. The rhythm of those knitting needles was supposed to be a metronome of peace, a quiet countdown to the arrival of a new life. For the first few weeks after Clara's tearful pregnancy announcement, that is exactly what it was. We spent our Saturday mornings looking at fabric swatches for the nursery, discussing the merits of pastel yellows versus soft sage greens. I allowed myself to believe the hostility over Richard's failed real estate venture was completely behind us. I thought the impending arrival of a baby had realigned her priorities, grounding her back in the solid, loving reality we had shared for 3 decades. But the pregnancy did not ground her. It merely accelerated her desperation to secure her place within Richard's wealthy, status-obsessed family before the baby actually arrived. Because she was pregnant, the wedding was hastily pushed forward, transforming from a tentative future plan into a massive, immediate logistical operation. Suddenly, my quiet house was filled with the frantic energy of wedding planners, floral designers, and exclusive caterers. And just as suddenly, I felt the atmosphere between Clara and me begin to shift again, taking on a subtle, deeply unsettling chill. It did not happen all at once. It was not a dramatic, screaming argument like the one we had over the trust funds. It was a slow, methodical, and chillingly deliberate erasure, the first noticeable crack in the evolution of our lives. Richard's parents, Arthur and Beatrice, were the kind of people who treated socializing as a ruthless, competitive sport. They hosted lavish dinners at their sprawling estate, exclusive gatherings meant to showcase their wealth and consolidate their social power. Naturally, as the mother of the bride in all but name, I fully expected to be included in these foundational family meetings. Instead, I found myself gently, yet firmly, excluded from every single one of them. At first, Claire framed her exclusions as acts of deep, protective concern for my overall physical well-being. When Arthur and Beatrice hosted an intimate engagement dinner for 50 of their closest friends at the local country club, Clara came to my house the morning of the big event. She sat at my kitchen table, placed her soft hand over mine, and looked at me with an expression of highly manufactured sympathy. She told me the dinner was going to be loud, chaotic, and incredibly late. She said she knew exactly how much I valued my quiet evenings and my strict schedule. She insisted I stay home, rest, and avoid the overwhelming noise, promising to bring me leftover cake the following afternoon. I did not want to stay home. I wanted to celebrate her. But she was so insistent, so seemingly tender in her concern, that I eventually relented, completely mistaking her calculated isolation for genuine maternal care. I stayed home and knitted, entirely unaware I was being quietly erased from her new public life. That pattern of exclusion rapidly accelerated. I was not invited to the bridal boutique when she selected her expensive silk gown. I was told the appointment was a last-minute cancellation. She eagerly scooped up, and there was simply no time to come pick me up. When Richard's mother hosted a high tea for the bridesmaids, Clara told me it was strictly for the younger girls. Even though Beatrice herself was my exact age, the message was becoming painfully clear, hidden beneath layers of false sweetness. I was not glamorous enough, not wealthy enough, and not polished enough to be properly presented to her new family. My sensible shoes and practical beige coats did not fit the wealthy aesthetic she was so desperately trying to project. The emotional sting of being pushed aside was profound, but my feelings were something I had always known how to manage. I could easily endure social rejection. What I could not ignore, however, were the glaring financial anomalies that began to accompany this sudden social isolation. While the main family trust remained securely locked behind my absolute authority, as trustee, there was another account. We shared a joint operating account, a holdover from the days when I managed the family hardware business. After the business was sold, I kept the account open to manage routine household expenses, emergency repairs on my home, and small incidental costs. It usually held a comfortable buffer of about $60,000. Because my name was primary, the monthly statements were mailed directly to my house. One Tuesday morning, I opened the bank statement while drinking my coffee and noticed a discrepancy. It was not a massive theft, but it was highly unusual. There was a withdrawal for $4,000, followed 2 days later by another withdrawal for $6,000. Both were processed as electronic transfers to an external account I did not recognize. I picked up my phone and called Clara immediately. I was not angry, merely curious, assuming she had used the funds for a wedding vendor deposit, and simply forgot to mention it to me. When she answered, the background noise was loud, filled with the clinking of silverware and polite chatter. She was clearly at a restaurant. I calmly asked her about the 2 transfers. Her response was immediate, defensive, and entirely dripping with condescension. "Eleanor, we talked about this," she said, letting out a long, exaggerated sigh that was meant to convey extreme patience. "I told you I was moving some money over to cover the floral deposits. We had a whole conversation about it on Sunday." I frowned, looking down at my meticulously kept calendar. "No, Clara. We did not speak on Sunday. You were at the Hamptons with Richard's family. We did not discuss this at all." "Yes, we did," she insisted, her voice raising just a fraction, taking on a sharp, patronizing edge. "I called you from the car. You told me to go ahead and make the transfer, Eleanor. Are you seriously forgetting things again? This is happening more and more lately. You are getting so confused." I sat perfectly still. The kitchen suddenly felt very cold. I had not forgotten anything. My memory was as sharp as the crease in a fresh ledger. I remembered exactly where I was, what I ate, and who I spoke to on Sunday. I had not spoken to Clara. She was lying. But it was not just a simple lie to cover a mistake. It was an aggressive, calculated lie designed specifically to make me doubt my own cognition. "I am not confused," I said, my voice dropping to a flat, professional register. "I simply need you to provide the receipts for the floral vendor so I can correctly reconcile the monthly statement." "I will bring them by later," she snapped, abruptly ending the call. She never brought the receipts. That was the first real crack in the ice. It was the moment the loving sister I raised vanished, replaced entirely by a stranger utilizing classic gaslighting techniques. The financial withdrawals continued, escalating in frequency. 3,000 here, 5,000 there. Every single time I brought it up, I was met with the exact same tactic. She would insist we had already discussed it. She would claim I had given her permission and simply forgot. She would look at me with wide, performed concern and tell me she was growing deeply worried about my declining mental state. She began weaponizing this false narrative of my cognitive decline in other areas of our life. If I reminded her about an appointment she missed, she would claim I had written down the wrong date because I was getting so forgetful. If I asked her a simple question about the wedding catering, she would roll her eyes and say she had already answered it 3 times. She was aggressively painting a portrait of an elderly woman who was rapidly losing her grip on reality. Then the physical manifestations of her manipulation began to appear in my own home. I have always been incredibly organized, a byproduct of my accounting career. I handle my mail the exact same way every single day. I bring it inside at noon, sort it on the entryway table, open the important documents immediately, and shred the junk. It is a system that has never failed me. But suddenly, my monthly bank statements mysteriously stopped arriving in the mailbox. At first, I naturally assumed it was just a simple postal error or a minor administrative oversight by the local sorting facility. I calmly called the bank manager and officially requested that duplicate copies be mailed to me immediately. But then, a very important annual tax document regarding the primary family trust also failed to show up on time. Exactly 1 week later, I suddenly realized I could not find my primary blue checkbook anywhere in the house. It had always lived in the very top upper left drawer of my heavy oak desk, a designated, secure place it had reliably occupied for over 20 long years. Now it was simply gone without a single trace. I spent an entire frustrating afternoon methodically tearing my home office apart, desperately looking for it in every conceivable corner. I was on my hands and knees, checking under the heavy wooden desk, when I heard the front door open. Clara let herself in using her key. She walked into the office, saw me on the floor, and let out a dramatic gasp. "Eleanor, what on earth are you doing?" she asked, rushing over to help me up with entirely excessive force. "I cannot find my checkbook," I said, brushing the dust off my slacks. "It is not in the drawer." "It is always in the drawer." Clara reached into the very drawer I had just emptied, slid her hand toward the back, and miraculously pulled out the blue checkbook. She held it up, looking at me with an expression of deep, tragic pity. "It was right here, Eleanor," she said softly, shaking her head. It was pushed to the back. You were looking right at it, and you did not even see it." I stared at the checkbook in her manicured hand. I had emptied that drawer completely. I had taken every single pen, paperclip, and envelope out of it. The checkbook had not been there. She had brought it with her. She had taken it, and now she was returning it just to prove a point. "You are really starting to slip, Eleanor," she continued, her voice taking on the soothing, patronizing tone one might use to speak to a frightened toddler. "Richard and I have been talking. We are getting very concerned about you living here all alone. You are getting on in years. The stress of managing the house, the bills, the family business accounts. It is clearly becoming entirely too much for you to handle." She walked over to my desk, casually placing the checkbook down next to my computer keyboard. She did not look at me as she delivered the final devastating blow she had been carefully building up to for months. "I think it is time we talk about transferring your power of attorney to me," she said, her voice terribly casual, as if she were suggesting a new restaurant for lunch. "Just to be safe. Just to make sure the bills get paid if you have another one of these little confusing episodes. You need someone to take over the heavy lifting so you can just relax and enjoy being a great aunt. I can handle the legal paperwork. Richard's lawyer has already drafted a preliminary document." The silence in the room was absolute. I looked at the daughter I had raised. I looked at the expensive designer handbag on her shoulder, paid for by my lifelong sacrifices. I looked at her perfectly styled hair and her cold, calculating eyes. She did not see a mother figure who had saved her life. She saw an obstacle. She saw an aging bank vault, and she was currently trying to convince me to voluntarily hand over the combination by making me believe I was going insane. I did not scream. I did not cry. The deep maternal hurt that had been bleeding in my chest for weeks suddenly stopped, cauterized instantly by a wave of pure, absolute professional detachment. The deeply wounded, emotional older sister completely vanished from my mind. The ruthless, analytical senior forensic accountant finally woke up and took total control of the situation. I recognized the exact, predictable behavioral pattern playing out right in front of me now. I had personally seen it executed 100 different times in cutthroat corporate boardrooms throughout my long career. The deliberate, systematic social isolation of the intended target. The relentless psychological gaslighting designed to break down confidence. The sudden, highly convenient disappearances of crucial physical financial records. The aggressively fast push for absolute unchecked legal authority over all remaining assets. It was a classic, perfectly executed, textbook elder asset grab. Clara was not just being a bridezilla. She was not just showing off for her wealthy new in-laws. She was actively executing a highly organized, malicious financial coup against me. I looked down at my hands. They were resting on the edge of the heavy oak desk. They were not shaking. They were perfectly, terrifyingly steady. "That is a very big step, Clara," I said, my voice completely smooth, devoid of any discernible emotion. "I will certainly need some time to think about something that significant. My memory might be slipping, but I still like to read what I sign." She smiled, clearly mistaking my calm demeanor for submission. "Of course, Eleanor. Take all the time you need. We just want what is best for you." She kissed my cheek, leaving a faint trace of expensive perfume behind, and walked out of my house. I stood in my office, listening to the heavy front door click shut. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I reached out and picked up the blue checkbook she had so generously found for me. My quiet generosity had been mistaken for weakness. My age had been mistaken for a terminal decline in intelligence. She thought I was a confused, frail old woman who was going to quietly surrender my entire life's work simply because she asked me to. She had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. I did not just manage money, I hunted thieves for a living. And now the thief was operating right inside my own home. I walked over to the front window, drew the heavy curtains completely shut, and walked back to my desk. I quietly turned on my large computer monitor, intensely watching the bright digital screen flicker to life in the dim, silent room. It was time to stop being a heartbroken sister. It was finally time for me to go back to work, and I was going to ensure she deeply regretted ever underestimating my intelligence. The blue light of the large computer monitor cast long, sharp shadows across the pale walls of my quiet office. Outside my window, the neighborhood was completely still, settling into the deep, undisturbed silence of a Tuesday night. I did not turn on the overhead lights, because I did not want the glare. I needed the singular, highly focused illumination of the screen, exactly as I had needed it during the thousands of complex, late-night corporate audits that defined my 40-year career. I sat down heavily in my leather desk chair, adjusted my reading glasses, and took a slow, deep breath. The emotional fog that had clouded my judgment for the past several months was completely gone. The lingering maternal doubt, the heavy guilt, the terrifying fear that my mind was actually failing me. All of it evaporated the moment Clara placed that deliberately hidden blue checkbook onto my desk. She had vastly overplayed her hand. In her arrogant, desperate rush to secure my power of attorney, she relied on the foolish assumption that my deep maternal love would permanently blind my professional instincts. She was entirely wrong. The woman sitting at the desk was no longer a grieving older sister desperately trying to hold a fractured family together. I was a senior forensic accountant, and I was finally looking at the raw data. I opened my encrypted password manager. I completely bypassed the standard joint checking account we shared. That account was merely the surface, the clumsy distraction where she had tested the waters with those small, easily disputed withdrawals. I knew exactly how sophisticated financial predators operated. If they were bold enough to steal $5,000 in plain sight and violently gaslight the victim about it, they were already stealing $50,000 in the dark. I went straight for the deep water. I logged directly into the primary family trust portal. The main trust was supposed to be an impenetrable fortress. I had personally structured it to require multiple layers of heavy security, including two-factor authentication tied directly to my personal cell phone. As I entered my complex credentials, a security code buzzed on my device. I typed it in, carefully watching the familiar dashboard load onto the large screen. At first glance, everything appeared perfectly normal. The high-yield dividend stocks were performing well. The principal balance of the massive index funds looked untouched. The superficial numbers at the top of the summary page matched my internal expectations. A less experienced eye would have logged out right then, feeling entirely reassured. But I never looked at the summary page. The summary page is where the most dangerous lies are always hidden. I navigated straight to raw transaction ledgers. I began pulling the automated clearinghouse data, the massive wire transfer histories, and the internal routing logs for the past 12 months. I exported massive amounts of data into a complex spreadsheet, my fingers moving across the keyboard with a rapid, practiced muscle memory that had not dulled one bit in my retirement. I applied a series of custom analytical filters I had designed decades ago to specifically isolate irregular transfer patterns, duplicate routing numbers, and unauthorized external account linkages. It took exactly 14 minutes for the first massive red flag to finally appear. He beneath a series of automated quarterly tax disbursements. A highly sophisticated corporate camouflage technique was a recurring outbound wire transfer. It was a flat, perfectly even number, $25,000, exiting the primary trust on the 15th of every single month for the past 8 months. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I stared at the digital row of numbers, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. $200,000. Gone. I highlighted the destination routing number. It belonged to a prominent national commercial bank, not the small regional institution where I kept all of our approved family accounts. I immediately pulled up the destination bank's portal. I did not have an account there, but Clara did, or, more accurately, someone pretending to be me did. Using the advanced fraud recovery access protocols I still retained through my professional alumni network, I initiated a backdoor verification ping on that specific routing number. The system instantly returned the basic account metadata. The ghost account was indeed registered entirely under my name. It used my social security number. It used my exact date of birth. But the primary contact email address was a newly created generic webmail account I had never seen before, and the phone number associated with the account authorization was an untraceable digital burner line. The sheer mechanics of her massive theft began to crystallize in my mind, forming a horrifyingly clear picture of premeditated, highly calculated fraud. To successfully bypass my two-factor authentication on the main trust without triggering an alert on my phone, she had to have compromised my physical devices. I thought back to all the times she had visited my house over the past year. The times she asked to borrow my phone to look up a recipe because hers was dead. The times she sat in my office, supposedly helping me organize my files, while I was in the kitchen making us tea. She had not been visiting me out of love. She had been conducting active surveillance. She had cloned my Authenticator app and intercepted the security texts, deleting them from my phone before I ever saw them. She had utilized my physical absence from the room to steal my digital identity. She used my social security number, my mother's maiden name, and the intimate personal details I had completely trusted her with to open a ghost account in my name. I needed to see the actual documents. I needed to see the signature cards. I routed a formal, time-stamped request through the portal's security verification system, utilizing my own administrative credentials to force a download of the ghost account's original opening paperwork. When the high-resolution PDF finally rendered on my screen, I felt a sickening physical drop in my stomach. There, on the bottom line of the digital application, was my signature. But it was not my signature. It was an incredibly precise, painstakingly practiced forgery. She had flawlessly captured the exact slant of my cursive, the sharp loop of the E in Eleanor, and the heavy pressure on the final consonant. It was a forgery so incredibly good that a standard bank teller would never have questioned it. She had studied my handwriting the exact same way she had studied my daily security habits. She had been planning this massive financial execution for well over a year. The heartbreak hit me then, a sudden, suffocating wave of pure grief that threatened to pull me entirely under. This was not a minor misunderstanding. This was not a desperate, panicked mistake made by a stressed young bride. This was a cold, systematic financial slaughter. The little girl I had rocked to sleep, the teenager I had proudly sent off to Paris, the young woman whose business I had enthusiastically funded, she did not exist. The person who forged that signature was a complete stranger, a ruthless predator who viewed my lifelong sacrifice as nothing more than a convenient, highly vulnerable ATM. A hot tear slipped down my cheek, landing heavily on the back of my hand. I did not wipe it away. I let it sit there, a physical reminder of the profound emotional death that was occurring in that dark room. I was actively mourning the total loss of my sister, but the agonizing grief was quickly overshadowed by a dark, burning curiosity. I had to know exactly where the stolen money was going. I downloaded the complete transaction history of the ghost account. The spreadsheet rapidly populated with hundreds of individual line items. I began to scroll, and as I read the expenditures, the tears instantly stopped. The profound sorrow was entirely replaced by an absolute freezing rage. She was not just stealing to cover unexpected wedding deposits. She was stealing to completely subsidize a wildly extravagant, entirely fraudulent luxury lifestyle. I saw exorbitant monthly lease payments for the luxury sports car Richard drove. I saw massive credit card payments to elite designer boutiques in the city. I saw $30,000 wired to a high-end interior decorator for her new apartment. I saw expensive dinners, luxury spa weekends, and exorbitant jewelry purchases. She was enthusiastically playing the role of the wealthy, sophisticated heiress for Richard's status-obsessed family, and she was doing it entirely with my stolen money. She was buying their approval, purchasing her seat at their exclusive table, by secretly bleeding me completely dry. And then I found it. The largest, most egregious single transaction on the entire digital ledger. A cleared electronic check for exactly $50,000, made payable directly to the Oak Ridge Country Club Event Management Department. The memo line simply read, "Baby shower." I stared at that line item until the numbers began to blur. Just 3 days ago, Clara had come over to my house, sat on my sofa, and enthusiastically told me all about the upcoming baby shower. She had explicitly bragged that Arthur and Beatrice, Richard's wealthy parents, were hosting the entire event at their exclusive country club. She had gushed about how generous they were, how they were pulling out all the stops to welcome their new grandchild in absolute style. She had used their supposed generosity as a vicious weapon against me, subtly implying that they were the ones who truly understood how to celebrate properly, unlike her rigid, financially conservative older sister. It was a complete fabricated lie. Arthur and Beatrice were not paying for a single drop of champagne. They were not paying for the extravagant floral arrangements or the imported caviar. I was paying for it, my retirement, my careful investments. The money I had meticulously saved for decades was currently funding the very event that I was not even deemed worthy enough to properly attend. I clicked on the itemized invoice attached to the country club payment. I read the staggering details: $10,000 for rare white orchids, $5,000 for a string quartet, $15,000 for a custom, imported seafood tower. As I read the ridiculous, ostentatious details, I looked up from the glowing monitor and glanced across the dark room. Resting quietly in the corner, illuminated only by the faint blue light of the screen, was my knitting basket. Inside it was the intricate handmade cashmere baby blanket. I had spent 6 agonizing months carefully weaving every single stitch, pouring my heart and my legacy into that soft ivory lattice. I had practically gone blind, trying to perfect the pattern, thinking it would be the most meaningful gift the baby could possibly receive. The contrast was so sharp, so violently insulting, that it literally took my breath away. While I was sitting alone in my quiet house, painstakingly knitting a symbol of enduring family love, she was actively forging my signature to steal $50,000 for a public spectacle of meaningless luxury. She did not value my love. She only valued my capital. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, the leather creaking loudly in the silent room. The physical exhaustion of the late hour completely vanished. My mind, previously clouded by maternal anxiety and manufactured confusion, was now operating with a terrifying, razor-sharp clarity. The professional forensic accountant in me evaluated the entire board. Clara had committed multiple counts of felony wire. She had committed severe identity theft. She had forged legal financial documents. She had crossed international banking lines with stolen assets. She was completely, utterly guilty, and she had left a massive, glaring digital paper trail that a first-year accounting student could easily follow. But she did not know that I knew. She firmly believed her own carefully constructed narrative. She believed the gaslighting was working perfectly. She truly believed that I was a declining, confused old woman who was just weeks away from voluntarily signing over my power of attorney. She thought she was completely safe. In the complex world of corporate fraud, there is a very specific moment when the auditor realizes they have the thief completely trapped. It is a moment of profound, quiet power. You do not confront them immediately. You do not send an angry email or make a furious phone call. Confrontation gives the thief time to panic. It gives them valuable time to destroy evidence, move the remaining assets, and hire aggressive legal defense teams. If you want to truly destroy a financial predator, you do not let them know they are caught. You play dumb. You let them continue to steal. You let them grow incredibly arrogant. You let them build their beautiful, expensive house of cards in Kurunkai. And then, only when they are standing at the very top, proudly showing it off to the entire world, do you violently kick out the foundational supports. I looked at the digital ledger one last time, my eyes tracing the $50,000 payment to the Oak Ridge Country Club. The baby shower was scheduled for next weekend. It was going to be the absolute pinnacle of her social climb, a massive, highly public display of her fabricated wealth, attended by every single important member of Richard's elite circle. She desperately wanted to use my money to prove she belonged with them. I decided right then and there to let her have her extravagant party. I carefully saved every single PDF, every transaction log, and every forged signature card onto a heavily encrypted external solid-state hard drive. I backed the drive up to a secure offshore cloud server that I maintained from my corporate days. I printed physical copies of the most damning documents and placed them inside a thick manila envelope, locking it inside my heavy fireproof floor safe. I meticulously cleared my browser history, scrubbed the digital footprint of my backdoor access, and reset the main trust portal to look exactly as it had before I logged in. I left absolutely zero trace of my late-night investigation. I closed the laptop. The blue light vanished, plunging the office back into total darkness. The silence of the house returned, but it no longer felt lonely. It felt like the calm, highly pressurized atmosphere inside a submarine right before a massive torpedo launch. I sat in the dark for a long time, letting the cold reality of my decision settle deep into my bones. I was not going to try to save her anymore. I was not going to try to heal our fractured family. The sister I raised was dead, replaced entirely by a parasite who wanted to ruin me. She wanted to treat me like a confused, helpless old woman. I would give her exactly the performance she demanded. I would let her believe she had completely won. I would hand her the shovel, smile warmly at her, and quietly watch as she dug a grave so incredibly deep she would never, ever be able to climb out of it. I stood up, walked over to the corner of the room, and looked down into the knitting basket. I reached in and gently ran my fingers over the soft cashmere. The blanket was almost finished. I decided I would finish it. I would complete the beautiful ivory lattice pattern. I would wrap it up in pristine protective plastic, and I would personally deliver it to her at that extravagant $50,000 baby shower. Because by the time she finally realized what I had actually brought her in my sensible leather purse, it would be far too late to stop the absolute financial annihilation that was coming for her. I walked out of my office, closed the heavy door behind me, and finally went to sleep. I slept perfectly, my mind completely at peace, fully ready to begin the ultimate audit of my sister's life, and prepared to flawlessly execute a retaliation that would leave absolutely nothing to chance. The morning sun broke through the kitchen blinds, painting sharp lines of light across the hardwood floor. I stood at the counter, methodically measuring coffee into the filter. My hands were perfectly steady. The suffocating grief that had paralyzed me just 24 hours earlier was gone, entirely replaced by a cold operational calm. My cell phone sat on the marble island, inches from my mug. The human instinct was to pick it up. The mother in me desperately wanted to dial Clara's number, to scream into the receiver, to demand a rational explanation for the staggering $50,000 she had just stolen to fund her lavish party. I wanted to hear her cry. I wanted her to beg for my forgiveness so I could find a way to salvage our fractured family. But the forensic accountant in me knew much better. Confrontation is the absolute greatest gift you can ever give a financial predator. If I called her in a screaming rage, I would instantly surrender my only tactical advantage. I would give her valuable time. Time to panic, time to empty the ghost off count, time to transfer the stolen funds to offshore shell companies, and time to hire a ruthless defense attorney paid for with my own money. If I warned her, she would immediately accelerate her timeline to declare me legally incompetent. I had seen it happen 100 times in corporate boardrooms. The moment the thief knows the auditor is onto them, the paper trail magically disappears into the shredder. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. It was bitter, grounding, and exactly what I needed. I made the hardest choice a parent figure can ever possibly make. I actively decided to stop being her protector. I decided to let her keep digging her own grave, and I was going to quietly hand her a much larger shovel. At 9 o'clock sharp, I put on my most conservative gray wool suit, picked up my heavy leather briefcase, and drove directly to the downtown branch of my primary bank. I did not go to the standard teller line. I bypassed the crowded lobby entirely and walked straight back to the executive offices. Marcus, the senior branch manager, had been a close professional ally of mine for over 2 decades. We had worked together on dozens of complex estate liquidations during my career. He knew my meticulous nature, and he respected my financial acumen deeply. He looked up from his mahogany desk as I closed his heavy glass door behind me and locked it. His warm, welcoming smile immediately faded when he saw the icy, hollow expression on my face. I sat down in the leather chair opposite him, opened my briefcase, and slid the thick manila envelope across the polished wood. I told him I needed him to look at the documents and do exactly what I said without asking any questions. He opened the envelope. I watched his eyes scan the printed ledgers, the forged signature cards, and the massive wire transfer logs from the ghost account. He was a seasoned banker. It only took him 2 minutes to fully comprehend the staggering scale of the theft. The color completely drained from his face as he stared at the fake signature. He told me it was a massive breach, stating we needed to freeze the secondary account immediately and call the Federal Fraud Division. He wanted to lock down my entire portfolio right that second. I told him sharply that he would do absolutely none of those things. He looked at me, thoroughly bewildered, pointing out that she was actively draining hundreds of thousands of dollars and could empty the remaining accessible liquidity by Friday if we did not intervene. I explained that was exactly what I wanted her to think she was doing. If we froze that ghost account right now, she would know I found it. She would immediately claim it was a misunderstanding, or worse. She would accelerate her pending legal petition to take over my power of attorney by claiming I was paranoid and financially unstable. I needed her to feel completely invincible for exactly 10 more days. I needed her to walk into that extravagant baby shower believing she had entirely won. Marcus stared at me, slowly realizing the sheer magnitude of the trap I was building. I pulled a clean legal pad from my briefcase and gave him my instructions. I wanted him to place a silent internal monitoring flag on the ghost account. I wanted a real-time digital copy of every single transaction she made, routed directly to my encrypted private server. But he was not to stop a single one of her outbound payments. He would let the credit lines flow freely. He would let her swipe those stolen cards for the caterers, the florists, and the event planners. Then I needed him to quietly sever the automated internal link between the main family trust and the joint checking account. We were going to build an invisible firewall around the primary principal to isolate the bleeding. I would manually transfer just enough bait money into the joint account to keep her satisfied and completely unaware that the main vault was now permanently locked. Marcus nodded slowly, a look of profound, quiet respect washing over his face. He picked up his secure telephone and began executing the silent internal overrides. The first massive wall of my fortress was successfully erected, completely cutting off her access to the vast majority of my wealth without her ever noticing. My next stop was a sleek, glass-fronted law firm located 3 blocks away. David was a senior partner in estate law, a brilliant, ruthlessly efficient attorney who had originally helped me draft the impenetrable framework of our family trust 20 years ago. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and right now I desperately needed his teeth. I sat in his expansive conference room, looking out over the city skyline as he meticulously reviewed the exact same printed evidence I had just shown Marcus. Unlike Marcus, David did not look shocked. He looked instantly, aggressively furious. He tossed the forged bank application onto the glass table, calling it a textbook, malicious elder asset grab. He pointed out that she was not just stealing cash, but systematically building a fabricated, highly documented case for my legal incompetence, the gaslighting, the hidden mail, the sudden demands for my power of attorney. She was laying the groundwork to have a judge declare me unfit, which would give her absolute, unmitigated control over the entire family estate. He wanted to file a preemptive strike immediately, serve her with a massive civil suit, and hand the file directly to the district attorney. I replied calmly that we would do all of those things, but not today. David frowned, leaning back in his chair, warning me that every day I waited was a massive liability because she was a highly motivated predator. I corrected him, stating she was a predator who relied entirely on the illusion of my weakness. If we struck now in private, she would spin it. She would cry to Richard's powerful family, play the victim, and use their massive financial resources to bury us in endless litigation. I absolutely refused to spend my retirement fighting her in a sterile courtroom. I pointed a perfectly steady finger at the $50,000 country club invoice lying on the table. She had bought herself a stage. She paid $50,000 of my money to ensure that every single important person in her new social circle would be in one room next weekend. I instructed David to draft the final devastating legal injunctions today. I wanted the asset freezes, the formal revocation of any implied financial consent, and the preliminary civil fraud filings completely finished and sitting in a folder. But we would not file them with the court until the exact moment I gave the signal. David's eyes narrowed as he quickly grasped the tactical brilliance of the timeline. He realized I wanted to execute the legal strike while she was actively spending the money in public. I confirmed I wanted to freeze her stolen credit lines while she was standing in the middle of that extravagant ballroom. I wanted her to answer for her crimes not to a judge behind closed doors, but to the wealthy in-laws she was desperately trying to impress. I wanted her completely, utterly exposed. To do that, I needed an impenetrable legal wall built around my remaining assets today, so I could safely spend the next 10 days playing the role of the absolute fool. David smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that told me he was entirely on board. We spent the next 4 hours drafting airtight, catastrophic legal documents. We prepared the emergency injunctions to freeze the ghost account. We drafted a massive, comprehensive civil suit for egregious financial damages and gross identity theft. We compiled a pristine, irrefutable evidence binder containing every single forged signature and stolen wire transfer. When we were finally finished, I placed the massive stack of devastating legal paperwork into my heavy briefcase, feeling the immense weight of absolute consequence. I drove back to my quiet suburban house just as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line. I unlocked the front door, walked into the hallway, and set my heavy briefcase down on the floor. I stood in front of the large hall mirror and stared deeply at my own reflection. The woman looking back at me was a formidable, highly competent professional who had just successfully secured a multi-million-dollar estate against a vicious internal attack. But Clara could absolutely never see that woman again. If I was going to successfully lure her into the trap, I had to completely disappear. I had to become the pathetic, declining caricature she had so maliciously invented. I closed my eyes and practiced the physical mechanics of the performance. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward, losing the rigid, confident posture I had maintained my entire adult life. I let the muscles in my face soften, adopting a perpetually bewildered, mildly anxious expression. I practiced trembling my hands just slightly, a subtle vibration in the fingers that would suggest deep neurological frailty. I was not just acting, I was actively weaponizing the very stereotypes she was trying to use against me. My cell phone rang in my pocket. It was Clara. I took a deep, steadying breath, let my shoulders slump, and answered the call. I made sure to let my voice waver just a fraction, injecting a tone of mild, breathy confusion when I said hello. Clara's voice was brisk, efficient, and dripping with that familiar, patronizing edge. She asked if I had finally found the important tax document she told me was arriving this week. She was fishing, checking to see if her active theft of my financial records was raising any alarms. I sighed heavily, rubbing my forehead as if I had a terrible headache. I apologized profusely, telling her I had spent the entire morning looking for it and tore the office apart. I told her I did not know where I put it, that I could not seem to keep anything straight today, and that my mind felt so terribly foggy. There was a brief pause on the line. I could practically hear the smug, victorious smile spreading across her face. Her tone instantly shifted to deep, performed sympathy as she told me not to upset myself. She said I was just getting tired, and that the house was too much for me to manage alone. She reminded me that this was exactly why Richard and she were so worried, and exactly why we needed to talk about that power of attorney paperwork soon. I whispered back with a note of tragic, defeated resignation, telling her she might be right. I said I was just so tired and thought I would just go lay down. I begged her not to worry about me and told her to go enjoy, planning her beautiful shower. She softly agreed, telling me to get some rest and promising that they would handle everything. She ended the call. I lowered the phone from my ear. My shoulders instantly snapped back. My spine straightened. The bewildered expression vanished from my face, completely replaced by a cold, terrifying smile. She had bought it completely. She was absolutely convinced that I was rapidly declining, that I was overwhelmed, and that she was mere days away from seizing total legal control of my life. She thought I was going to quietly lie down and surrender everything to her. She had absolutely no idea that I had just spent the entire day methodically building a steel cage around her. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was heavily loaded. My trusted allies were watching silently and in the shadows, holding the keys to her absolute destruction. This marked my absolute pivot into playing dumb. I resolved right then to lean entirely into the character of the frail, forgetful old woman, dropping my guard so completely that she would drop hers entirely. The countdown to the country club had officially begun, and I was going to give the performance of a lifetime. I walked back into my home office and looked at the heavy fireproof floor, safe tucked perfectly beneath my wooden desk. It was a silent monument to my former life as a mother figure and a heavy iron tomb for her financial future. I went into the living room and picked up my weaving basket. The beautiful ivory lattice cashmere blanket was waiting for me. I sat in my armchair, picked up the needles, and began to work. Each precise stitch was a second ticking off the clock. Each completed row brought her closer to the absolute ruin she so richly deserved. I knitted with the cold precision of a machine, feeling absolutely no remorse for the devastation I was about to unleash. I had offered her a lifetime of unconditional love, and she had chosen to spit in my face for a country club membership. She was about to learn a very hard lesson. My silence was not weakness. My patience was not confusion. I was simply waiting for the perfect moment to completely destroy her false reality. Over the next 10 days, I would need to meticulously maintain this grand illusion, giving her just enough rope to hang herself publicly. I would smile at her condescension. I would apologize for my fabricated mistakes. I would let her parade me around as the perfect example of a broken, fading elder. But when the time finally came, when the music stopped and the bills arrived, the frail old woman would permanently vanish. I would be the accountant again, and the final audit of her life was going to leave her with absolutely nothing but massive debt and regret. The next 2 months required a level of disciplined theatricality I had never previously needed to access. I spent my entire professional life projecting an aura of absolute competence, sitting up straight in corporate boardrooms, demanding accountability with a sharp, unwavering voice. Now I had to systematically dismantle that formidable posture. I began with my physical movements. I deliberately slowed my walking pace, allowing my shoulders to round forward just a fraction. When I reached for a coffee cup or a pen, I let my hand hesitate, introducing a very slight, manufactured tremor into my fingers. The physical acting was exhausting, but the psychological performance was far more demanding. I had to fundamentally alter how I communicated with the daughter I had raised. Whenever Clara came over, I stopped offering sharp, analytical advice. Instead, I cultivated a permanent expression of mild bewilderment. I started leaving my reading glasses in completely illogical places around the house, forcing her to find them for me. I would purposefully lose my train of thought right in the middle of a sentence, trailing off into a confused, breathy silence. I apologized constantly. I apologized for my forgetfulness, for the messy kitchen, and for being a burden. Clara reacted to my manufactured decline with a terrifying, predatory eagerness. She did not show an ounce of genuine heartbreak over my supposed deterioration. Instead, she became profoundly emboldened. Her previously subtle gaslighting morphed into overt, condescending cruelty. If I asked a simple question about her day, she would loudly sigh, rolling her eyes and telling me she did not have the energy to explain things twice to a confused old woman. She began walking through my home as if she already owned it, casually rearranging my furniture and openly criticizing my conservative wardrobe with cruel, dismissive little laughs. Her arrogance expanded exponentially, directly fueled by the financial trap I had secretly constructed. The ghost account, heavily monitored by Marcus at the bank, was now fully operational as the perfect bait. I had securely walled off the primary family trust, leaving just enough capital in the secondary trap account to fund her immediate illusions. I spent my evenings sitting alone in my dark office, logging into my secure private server to watch the live transaction data. Every time she swiped that stolen credit card, a digital alert silently pinged on my screen, documenting her absolute guilt perfectly. Watching those numbers drain was a profound exercise in psychological endurance. I watched her spend $500 on imported silk napkins for a dinner party I was not invited to attend. I watched her drop $2,000 at an exclusive maternity boutique in the city. The sheer audacity of her theft was breathtaking, but I never once intervened. I let the credit lines flow with completely unrestricted freedom. I needed her to feel an intoxicating, unchecked power. The more she stole, the deeper she buried herself in felony fraud, entirely unaware that the auditor was quietly watching. The sheer volume of data I processed during those late-night sessions was staggering. I meticulously cataloged every single fraudulent swipe, building an impenetrable evidentiary wall. She purchased expensive vintage wines, charging them directly to the ghost account, completely ignorant of the fact that I was archiving the digital receipts. She hired a private boutique interior decorator to completely redesign her living room, transferring $15,000 in a single afternoon. I watched the digital numbers drain from the trap account, feeling a cold calculating satisfaction. Every dollar she stole was another heavy nail driven directly into her impending coffin. My professional background had trained me to view financial theft devoid of any emotional attachment. I treated Clara not as my beloved sister, but as a hostile corporate entity actively attempting a hostile takeover of my assets. I built spreadsheets directly comparing her purchases against the dates she visited my house to gaslight me. The correlation was absolutely undeniable. On the exact days she spent hours berating me for my supposed memory loss, the stolen credit card activity spiked massively. She was actively using her cruel psychological abuse of me to aggressively fuel her exorbitant, fraudulent spending sprees. By the third week of my performance, she finally brought Richard over to my house. They did not come for a social visit. They came for an inspection. Richard walked through my front door, wearing a tailored navy suit and an expression of profound entitlement. He looked at my modest, sensible furnishings with open disgust. Clara led him into the kitchen, holding his hand, while I deliberately fumbled with the tea kettle. I let my hands shake violently enough that I spilled hot water on the counter. I gasped, frantically apologizing, and wiping it up with trembling, panicked fingers. Clara immediately swooped in, physically pushing me away from the counter. With a harsh, theatrical sigh, she looked at Richard and shook her head, loudly whispering that I was becoming a severe danger to myself. Richard leaned against the marble island, crossing his arms and looking at me as if I were a broken appliance that needed to be hauled to the junkyard. He told me in a slow, patronizing voice that I really needed to stop trying to do things on my own. He said they were deeply concerned about my safety and my rapidly failing memory. They sat me down at my own kitchen table and slid a thick stack of legal document in front of me. It was the power of attorney paperwork. Clara placed a heavy, expensive fountain pen right next to my shaking hand. She spoke to me in the soothing, dangerous tone of a viper preparing to strike. She promised that if I just signed the papers, she would take care of all the stressful bills and complex banking. She swore I would never have to worry about a single financial detail ever again. She was technically telling the absolute truth. If I signed that paper, she would immediately drain everything, and I would certainly never have a single financial detail left to worry about. I looked down at the documents, my forensic accountant, mind rapidly scanning the predatory legal clauses. It was an absolute, unconditional surrender of my entire estate. I looked up at her, forcing tears to well in my eyes, portraying absolute, terrified submission. I picked up the heavy fountain pen, my hand violently trembling. I hovered the gold nib over the signature line for an agonizingly long moment, letting them hold their breath in eager anticipation. Maintaining that terrifying mask of compliance while holding the heavy fountain pen was the hardest acting I had ever done. The forensic accountant inside me was screaming to snap the pen in half, to look her dead in the eye and list every single felony she had committed over the past 2 months. I wanted to watch the smug, arrogant smile melt completely off her face. I wanted Richard to realize he was marrying a broke, desperate thief rather than a wealthy heiress. But I forced that aggressive instinct down, burying it beneath a thick layer of performed panic. I knew that if I broke character right then, if I showed even a fraction of my true competence, They would immediately go on the defensive. They would leave the house, call their aggressive lawyers, and the battle would be dragged out in sterile courtrooms for years. I absolutely refused to allow that to happen. I needed this execution to be swift, public, and entirely indisputable. So I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my lower lip tremble violently, fully committing to the pathetic illusion that I was a completely shattered, terrified old woman. Then I purposely dropped the pen. It clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor, spilling a small drop of dark ink on the pristine legal document. I covered my face with my hands and began to quietly sob, performing a flawless imitation of a broken, overwhelmed elder. I cried out that I was just too tired, that I could not focus on the tiny words today, and that my head was pounding terribly. I begged them to just leave the papers on the desks so I could look at them tomorrow, when my mind was feeling a little bit clearer. Richard aggressively sighed, muttering a sharp curse under his breath. Clearly furious that the prize had temporarily slipped through his fingers, Clara shot him a warning glance, ever the dedicated actress in front of her audience. She patted my shoulder with a cold, stiff hand, telling me not to cry. She said we could definitely finish the paperwork right after the baby shower. She promised she would come over the day after the big party, and we would get everything officially finalized. They left my house absolutely confident that total victory was just a few short days away. The moment their luxury car pulled out of my driveway, the tears instantly stopped. My trembling hands became perfectly still. I walked over to the kitchen table, picked up the ruined power of attorney document, and fed it directly into my industrial paper shredder. I did not need to pretend anymore for the rest of the day. The trap was fully set, and the timeline was securely locked into place. She had tied her ultimate legal victory directly to the aftermath of the baby shower. The stakes for that specific weekend were now impossibly high for both of us. I spent the remaining week leading up to the shower in a state of icy absolute focus. I finished knitting the heirloom cashmere baby blanket, carefully tying off the final intricate stitches of the ivory lattice pattern. I washed it in gentle unscented soap, letting it dry flat in my sunny guest room. I folded it with mathematical precision and wrapped it in a layer of pristine protective plastic. It was a beautiful, innocent artifact representing decades of my unconditional love, deeply contrasting with the devastating legal destruction I was currently carrying inside. My heavy leather briefcase every day. The morning of the baby shower finally arrived, bringing with it a bitter, freezing drizzle that perfectly matched the coldness inside my chest. The sky was a heavy, unforgiving gray, casting a dull light over my quiet suburban street. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and carefully assembled my armor. I did not wear the elegant tailored navy dress I had originally purchased for this exact occasion months ago. Instead, I put on a pair of plain, sensible black slacks and a slightly faded beige blouse. I pulled my gray hair into a severe, tight bun. I slipped into my thick, practical beige winter coat, ignoring the expensive silk scarf hanging in my closet. I looked exactly like the frail, out-of-touch old woman Clara desperately needed me to be. I picked up the plastic-wrapped cashmere blanket, holding it carefully in the crook of my left arm. With my right hand, I picked up my heavy, reinforced leather purse. Inside that purse rested the thick envelope containing the final devastating judicial injunctions, completely finalized by David the previous afternoon. It was the absolute heaviest thing I had ever carried in my entire 68 years. I drove my sensible sedan slowly through the freezing rain, navigating the slick roads toward the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club. I did not use the main valet line when I arrived. I parked my car at the very back of the sprawling wet asphalt lot, ensuring I would have a long, slow walk to the main entrance. I wanted to feel the biting cold. I wanted the rain to dampen my coat and flatten stray hairs against my cheeks. I wanted to look slightly pathetic and thoroughly battered by the elements when I finally reached those grand limestone steps. The Country Club was a towering monument to exorbitant wealth, built from pale stone and heavy frosted glass. Golden light poured from the massive front windows, illuminating the freezing drizzle falling around the entrance. As I slowly walked up the grand stair, I could hear the muffled, elegant sounds of the expensive jazz trio I had unknowingly paid for. I smelled the rich, buttery aroma of the imported catering. It was a $50,000 spectacle of stolen luxury, perfectly designed to elevate Clary into the highest echelons of Richard's status-obsessed family. And I was about to completely ruin it. The visual contrast between my soaked, practical attire and the extravagant venue was intentionally jarring. The Oak Ridge Country Club was a fortress of exclusionary wealth. As I walked past the massive heavy glass windows, I caught brief glimpses of the extravagant event inside. I saw towering, ridiculous floral centerpieces made entirely of rare imported white orchids, easily costing $10,000 alone. I saw waiters carrying silver platters of expensive caviar and pouring endless flutes of vintage champagne. Every single drop, every single petal, was paid for with my stolen retirement funds, entirely authorized by my forged signature. I felt the cold rain sliding down the back of my neck, but the chill did not bother me. The icy weather was the perfect atmospheric backdrop for the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. I approached the heavy frosted glass doors with the slow, measured pace of an executioner walking toward the gallows. I knew exactly what was waiting for me on the other side of those doors. I knew Clara would be stationed there, acting as the ultimate gatekeeper to her stolen kingdom. I adjusted my grip on my heavy leather purse and prepared for combat. I reached the top of the grand limestone steps, the cold seeping entirely through my practical leather shoes, and there she was. Clara stood just outside the heavy frosted glass doors, completely blocking my path. She wore a breathtaking custom-tailored maternity dress, dripping in diamond jewelry, holding a crystal glass of sparkling cider. She looked like a wealthy, untouched queen, guarding her expensive castle. When she saw me standing there in the freezing rain, her perfectly painted smile vanished, instantly replaced by a look of profound, unmasked disgust. The climax of my 2-month performance had officially commenced immediately. She looked down at my damp, sensible beige coat and the practical leather purse slung heavily over my shoulder. "You cannot come inside looking like that, Eleanor," she hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh, hushed whisper so the lingering valet attendants would not overhear her cruelty. "Just look at yourself. You are dripping wet. You are a complete mess." I held out the carefully wrapped package, keeping my voice mild and steady despite the sharp adrenaline spiking in my veins. "I brought the blanket, the one I made for the baby. I just wanted to bring it in." She did not reach for it. She crossed her arms over her expensive silk dress, actively shielding her bump as if my very presence were a toxic contagion. "No, absolutely not. Richard and his parents are in there. Half the corporate board of directors is in there. I told them you were not coming today because you have not been feeling well." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with that familiar practiced cruelty. "I am not having you wander around embarrassing me in front of my new family with your confused little episodes. You have been slipping constantly lately." She was aggressively playing her final card, weaponizing my manufactured decline to banish me from the very party my own stolen money was currently funding. "I am perfectly fine," I said quietly, playing the role of the meek, rejected sister perfectly. The bitter wind whipped a strand of wet gray hair across my cold cheek. "I came to celebrate." She let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Well, you are absolutely not celebrating in here," she snapped. She gestured sharply toward the dark, busy street behind me, her manicured nails a flash of crimson in the dull gray afternoon. "Go wait in that dirty pub across the street until we are finished here. Order a tea or something. When the shower is finally over and the important family has gone home, I will come find you. Do not make a scene, Eleanor. Just do exactly as I say." She turned her back on me, firmly pulling open the heavy frosted glass door. Warm, golden light spilled out onto the wet pavement for just a second, bringing with it the joyful sound of laughter and expensive perfume. Before the heavy door clicked firmly and permanently shut right behind her, she had done it. She had delivered the ultimate public humiliation, successfully banishing the woman who raised her to a greasy tavern in the freezing rain. I stood perfectly still on the wet limestone steps for a long moment. I looked down at the handmade cashmere blanket, the intricate stitches representing hours of deep love and anticipation, now completely meaningless in my cold hands. I felt a slight tremble in my fingers, but it was not from the biting cold, and it was certainly not from sorrow. It was the pure, intoxicating adrenaline of absolute, undeniable tactical victory. I nodded to the empty steps. I lowered my head, deliberately letting my shoulders slump just enough to complete the tragic picture of the meek, defeated old woman she fully believed me to be. I slowly turned away from the golden light of the country club and walked carefully down the slippery limestone steps, heading back toward the busy street. As I walked, I adjusted the thick strap of my leather purse. It felt incredibly heavy against my hip, completely loaded with the legal ammunition required to end her entire fabricated life. My mind was not slipping whatsoever. I stepped off the wet curb and crossed the busy asphalt street, the freezing rain continuing to fall in sheets. The pub she had so arrogantly directed me toward was a stark, jarring contrast to the elegant country club. It was a dimly lit local worker tavern with neon beer signs buzzing loudly in the smudged front windows. The heavy wooden door groaned as I pushed it open. The air inside smelled strongly of stale beer, fried food, and damp wool coats. It was exactly the kind of unpretentious, gritty establishment Clara and Richard would never dare to enter. I stood in the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the dark, smoky interior. The lunchtime crowd was sparse, mostly older men sitting silently at the long mahogany bar, watching a muted television screen. I walked past them, my wet shoes squeaking softly against the scuffed linoleum floor, and headed straight toward the very back of the deep, narrow room. I bypassed the empty tables and walked toward a secluded, semicircular leather booth hidden in the darkest corner. Sitting at that table, nursing a simple glass of ice water and checking his gold watch, was my lawyer. David looked up as I approached. He was wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in the gritty surroundings. He slid completely over in the leather booth to make room for me. I sat down heavily, placing the plastic-wrapped cashmere baby blanket carefully onto the sticky wooden table. I did not shed a single tear. I did not order a pint of beer to drown my fabricated sorrows. I simply unclasped the heavy brass buckle of my sensible leather purse and pulled out the thick manila envelope containing our final devastating legal weapons. The pub was filled with the low, rumbling murmur of casual conversations and the clinking of heavy pint glasses. It was a space completely devoid of pretension, a massive departure from the sterilized, expensive environment Clara was currently enjoying across the street. David had chosen this exact location for its proximity, but the poetic justice of the setting was absolutely undeniable. While Clara was dancing under expensive crystal chandeliers paid for with stolen money, the true owner of that wealth was sitting quietly in a dark, sticky booth, calmly preparing to completely vaporize her entire fabricated financial existence. David had not come completely alone. Sitting quietly in the booth directly behind him, nursing a black coffee and completely ignoring the television, was a senior paralegal from his firm. He was there to serve as the official, independent legal witness to my signatures, ensuring that Clara could never claim I was coerced or confused when I signed the final injunctions. We had left absolutely zero room for error. The legal trap was meticulously constructed, reinforced with heavy steel, and ready to snap shut with terrifying, bone-crushing force. I took a deep breath, smelling the stale pub air. I placed the envelope on the table between us. David opened it quickly, his eyes scanning the chaotic, noisy pub before looking back at me with a sharp, predatory grin. "Did she take the bait?" he asked, his voice low and utterly devoid of sympathy for my sister. "She swallowed the hook completely," I replied, my voice losing the breathy, confused tone I had utilized for 2 agonizing months, instantly returning to the sharp, commanding register of a senior forensic accountant. "She banished me to this exact booth. She is currently inside, actively swiping the stolen credit lines." David pulled a sleek silver pen from the inside pocket of his expensive suit jacket. He laid the final, binding judicial injunctions flat against the sticky wooden table. These were not the preliminary drafts we had constructed 2 months ago. These were the active, court-ready execution orders. They explicitly detailed the immediate freezing of the ghost account, the total revocation of all associated credit lines, and the formal initiation of massive civil fraud proceedings. All they required to become instantly legally binding was my final signature. I took the silver pen from his hand with perfectly steady fingers. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single drop of maternal guilt. I signed my name on the bottom line of the first document, the heavy Deliberate strokes of my cursive, completely overriding the meticulous forgery she had used to steal my wealth. I signed the second document, authorizing Marcus at the bank to drop the invisible firewall and lock the secondary trap account permanently. I signed the third document, formally launching the massive civil lawsuit that would completely bankrupt her new husband's arrogant family if they foolishly decided to try and defend her in open court. I handed the pen back to David. He carefully gathered the signed documents, placed them back into the thick envelope, and pulled out his encrypted cell phone. He dialed a private number, waiting exactly 3 seconds before speaking. "Execute at the freeze," he said firmly. "All targeted accounts, effective immediately. Decline all pending authorizations." He ended the brief call and looked at me across the small table. "It is done, Eleanor," he said quietly. "The credit lines are completely dead. The ghost account is permanently locked. She has absolutely zero access to your money as of this exact second." I looked at the buzzing neon beer sign hanging in the dark window of the dirty pub. Directly across the busy street, I could clearly see the golden frosted glass doors of the exclusive country club. Right at this very moment, inside that opulent ballroom, a waiter in a crisp white tuxedo was carrying a silver tray holding a staggering $50,000 catering bill directly toward Clara and her perfectly manicured hands. The grand performance of the frail, forgetful older sister was officially and permanently concluded. It was finally time for the ruthless forensic accountant to cross the street. I pushed the heavy wooden door of the dirty pub open and stepped back out into the freezing rain. The bitter wind immediately whipped against my sensible beige coat, but the cold no longer registered in my mind. The frail, terrified older sister, who had nervously clutched a handmade cashmere blanket just 30 minutes ago, was completely gone. I was walking with the perfectly measured, aggressive stride of a senior forensic accountant who had just closed the most important audit of her entire career. I stepped off the cracked sidewalk and began crossing the busy street toward the Grand Club. The rain was falling in thick, heavy sheets, obscuring the golden light spilling from the massive front windows, but I did not rush. I took my time, letting the icy water completely soak my hair and run down my cheeks. I wanted to look exactly like the pathetic, discarded burden she had so cruelly banished to the dark shadows. The physical contrast between my soaked, battered appearance and the pristine, absolute destruction contained inside my heavy leather purse was deeply intoxicating. I reached the bottom of the grand limestone steps and looked up at the heavy glass entrance doors standing perfectly. The valet attendants were huddled under the massive canvas awning, shivering and smoking cigarettes. Completely ignoring the soaked older woman walking purposefully past them, I gripped the thick leather handle of my heavy briefcase tightly. I took one deep, steadying breath of freezing air and pulled the heavy front doors completely open. The transition from the miserable freezing street into the grand lobby of the exclusive country club was violently sudden. The warm air inside was thick with heavy, expensive perfume and the overwhelming, rich scent of catered roasted meats. I stood perfectly still in the beautiful marble foyer very silently. Water aggressively dripped from my wet hem onto the perfectly polished stone floor. A young hostess in a sharp black uniform immediately stepped out from behind a mahogany podium, her eyes darting nervously toward my soaked, entirely inappropriate clothing. She opened her mouth to speak, clearly intending to intercept the homeless-looking woman who had suddenly wandered into their exclusive sanctuary. I did not stop walking. I did not even look at her. I walked straight past the expensive mahogany podium, my wet rubber soles squeaking loudly against the pristine marble. I rounded the massive stone lobby pillar very quickly. I stepped directly into the main entrance of the extravagant ballroom. The sheer, unmitigated scale of her theft was absolutely staggering to witness in person. The massive room was draped in flowing white silk, illuminated by 3 towering crystal chandeliers. A professional string quartet was playing a gentle, classical melody in the far corner. The tables were covered in imported silver platters piled incredibly high with massive shrimp and rare imported caviar. Everywhere I looked, I saw my own stolen retirement funds actively on display, financing her arrogant social climbing with absolutely zero regard for my future financial survival. I waited. The ballroom was packed with wealthy guests wearing tailored suits and expensive designer dresses. They were laughing softly, sipping vintage champagne from delicate crystal flutes, completely oblivious to the massive financial fraud funding their elegant afternoon. I stood quietly in the shadowy entrance, letting my eyes rapidly scan the massive room until I finally found her. Clara was standing near the center of the ballroom, holding court beside a towering, ridiculous floral centerpiece made entirely of rare white orchids. She was smiling brightly, her hand resting delicately on her baby bump, playing the perfect role wonderfully today. She felt perfectly safe. Standing directly beside her were Richard and his incredibly wealthy parents, Arthur and Beatrice. Arthur wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, looking utterly bored, while Beatrice stood rigidly in a stiff silver dress, projecting an aura of immense, demanding judgment. Clara was currently speaking directly to Beatrice, leaning forward with an eager, desperate smile, desperately trying to secure her permanent place within their elite social circle. Richard stood slightly behind her, holding a crystal glass of scotch, looking arrogant and completely satisfied. They looked like a perfect, powerful family, completely untouched by consequence, living inside a beautiful, fraudulent painted lie. I did not immediately announce my presence. I remained completely silent in the shadows, waiting patiently for the precise, perfect moment to strike. I knew the exact schedule of the event because I had meticulously reviewed the stolen vendor contracts online. It was currently 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The main dining service had just officially concluded, which meant the country club event manager would be arriving very shortly to collect the final payment before the guests began to depart. I watched the heavy wooden kitchen doors swing open on the far side of the massive, elegant, bright, wealthy ballroom. A tall, severely dressed event manager walked confidently out of the busy kitchen. He was carrying a sleek black leather folio containing the final catering invoice. He moved smoothly through the crowded ballroom, expertly navigating past the silver trays and laughing guests, heading directly toward Clara and her wealthy new family. My heart rate remained perfectly slow and absolutely steady. The trap was now fully in motion, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop the devastating sequence of events I had carefully initiated from that dark pub across the street just 10 short minutes ago, entirely alone. The event manager stopped politely, just a few feet away from Clara. He waited patiently for a brief lull in her eager conversation with Beatrice, before stepping forward with a practiced, deferential smile. He bowed his head slightly, opened the black leather folio, and quietly presented the staggering $50,000 bill directly to her. Clara did not even flinch. She smiled brightly at the manager, projecting total unbothered wealth. She reached confidently into her expensive designer handbag, pulling out the shiny platinum credit card she had fraudulently opened using my heavily forged signature and stolen social security number entirely illegally. She handed the stolen card to the manager with a grand theatrical flourish, making absolutely sure that Arthur and Beatrice saw exactly how easily she could cover the massive expense. The manager thanked her politely, pulled a sleek digital payment terminal from his dark suit pocket, and smoothly swiped the platinum card. The string quartet continued, playing their gentle classical melody in the corner. The guests continued laughing and drinking expensive champagne. I stood perfectly still in the shadows, watching the tiny digital screen on the manager's payment terminal with the intense predatory focus of a hunting hawk, silently waiting. The machine processed the request for exactly 3 seconds. Then a sharp, loud electronic beep violently pierced the polite murmur of the ballroom. The manager frowned slightly, looking down at the digital screen in mild confusion. He cleared his throat softly, keeping his voice carefully low and entirely respectful. He quietly informed Clara that the card had unfortunately been declined, suggesting it was likely just a simple security flag due to the massive transaction amount. Clara let out a short, highly exaggerated laugh, dramatically rolling her eyes at Richard to signal her annoyance with the supposed banking error. Quickly moving, she aggressively snatched the first card back from the manager and immediately pulled a second shiny credit card from her expensive designer purse. This was the secondary card linked directly to the massive ghost account I had just permanently frozen. She handed it over with a sharp, condescending sigh, loudly complaining about the sheer incompetence of modern banking systems. The manager apologized profusely, swiped the second card through the digital terminal, and waited. The machine processed the request again. 3 seconds later, the exact same sharp, loud, electronic beep violently echoed through the sudden, heavy silence of the wealthy group. The event manager's polite smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of tight, professional concern. He looked directly at Clara, his voice losing its deferential warmth, politely informing her that the second card had also been completely declined by the issuing bank. Beatrice shifted her weight, her rigid posture stiffening even further as she stared at Clara with open, icy judgment. Richard finally stepped forward, his face flushing red with sudden intense embarrassment. He angrily demanded to know what the hell was going on, quietly hissing at Clara to just give the man a card that actually worked properly today. Clara was suddenly breathing very fast. Her perfectly painted smile shattered into a look of genuine absolute panic. She frantically dug through her designer purse, her hands shaking violently as she desperately searched for another stolen card. She pulled out a third piece of plastic and practically shoved it into the manager's chest, her voice rising in pitch as she aggressively demanded he try it again. The manager swiped the third card. The machine violently beeped again. Declined. The silence surrounding their small group suddenly became incredibly heavy, entirely suffocating the joyful atmosphere of the surrounding wealthy elite club guests. Beatrice crossed her arms over her stiff silver dress, looking at Clara with absolute unmitigated disgust. She loudly asked Richard if his new fiancée was actually capable of paying for her own extravagant party, or if they were expected to cover the massive bill for her entirely fabricated lifestyle. Clara gasped, her face turning a shocking shade of pale white. She frantically began typing on her expensive cell phone, desperately trying to log into the frozen ghost account to check the stolen balances. I knew she was currently seeing nothing but massive red error codes and locked portal warning screens. This was the exact, perfect moment. I stepped out of the dark shadows and walked slowly into the bright, warm light of the extravagant ballroom. The wet rubber soles of my sensible shoes squeaked loudly against the polished hardwood floor, a harsh, jarring sound that immediately drew the attention of the surrounding guests. The crowd of wealthy elites slowly parted before me, staring in absolute shock at the soaking wet, plainly dressed older woman confidently marching directly toward the center of their exclusive gathering. I did not break my aggressive stride until I stood directly behind my sister very quietly. "They are not going to work, Clara," I said. My voice was not loud, but the absolute freezing authority in my tone cut through the silent ballroom like a heavy steel blade. Clara violently spun around, dropping her expensive cell phone onto the polished hardwood floor. She stared at me, her eyes wide with absolute, unmasked terror. She looked at my soaked beige coat, my dripping gray hair, and the heavy leather briefcase clutched tightly in my steady hand. She realized instantly that the frail, confused older woman she had cruelly banished to the pub was completely dead forever today. Despite the sheer terror in her eyes, she foolishly attempted to deploy her familiar gaslighting tactics one final time. She let out a frantic, breathless laugh and immediately turned toward Arthur and Beatrice. She loudly proclaimed that her poor, confused sister must have wandered back across the street by mistake, insisting that I was deeply unwell and did not know what I was saying. She aggressively reached out to grab my arm, her manicured nails digging sharply into my wet wool coat, forcefully demanding that I leave the ballroom immediately before I caused a terrible scene in public right now. I did not pull away. I simply looked down at her hand and then looked directly into her terrified eyes. I spoke with the cold, measured precision of a senior auditor presenting final criminal charges. "Take your hand off my coat," I ordered, my voice completely devoid of any sisterly warmth. Clara instantly released my arm, physically recoiling from the absolute coldness in my eyes. She took a step back, bumping directly into Richard, who was staring at me with deep, entirely unmasked confusion. The entire ballroom was now completely silent, watching the sudden, violent destruction of her beautiful facade. I calmly unclasped the heavy brass buckle of my sensible leather briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, meticulously organized audit ledger I had printed the night I discovered her massive theft. I dropped the heavy binder directly onto the closest silver catering table. The loud smack of the heavy paper hitting the metal violently echoed through the isolate room, causing Beatrice to jump slightly in shock. I flipped the heavy binder open to the first page, revealing the massive, undeniably clear spreadsheets documenting every single stolen dollar she had fraudulently extracted from my retirement accounts, very deliberately. You cannot pay this massive catering bill today, Clara, because I just permanently froze the stolen ghost account you illegally opened, using my forged signature and stolen social security number. I stated loudly and incredibly clearly, ensuring that every single wealthy guest in the immediate vicinity heard the exact criminal charges. Clara let out a choked, terrified sob, raising her trembling hands to her pale face. Richard loudly demanded to know what the hell I was talking about, aggressively stepping forward to defend his panicking fiancée. I did not look at him. I simply turned the ledger page over smoothly. She has been actively stealing from my secure family trust for exactly 8 months, I continued, my voice echoing loudly in the absolute silence. I pointed a perfectly steady finger directly at the highlighted bank statements. She fraudulently established massive external credit lines using my personal identity. She stole $200,000 to completely subsidize her fake luxury lifestyle, buying expensive cars, designer clothes, and this entirely ridiculous $50,000 party, strictly to impress your arrogant family. Beatrice gasped loudly, her hand flying to her pearl necklace in absolute horror, as the terrible truth finally landed completely perfectly. Clara began to violently sob, completely dropping her polished posture. She fell to her knees in her expensive silk dress, crying massive, ugly tears. She frantically begged me to stop talking, screaming that I was completely ruining her entire life. She tried to play the victim one final time, looking up at Richard and screaming that I was a bitter, jealous old woman who was just making up terrible lies to violently destroy her happiness. She swore on her unborn child that she had never stolen a single penny, desperately clinging to the very last shreds of her pathetic lie. I simply reached back into my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a secondary, much thinner manila envelope. This envelope did not contain complex banking ledgers. It contained the printed copies of her own highly venomous text messages, completely recovered from the secure digital backups on my phone. I handed the open envelope directly to Beatrice, completely bypassing Clara's frantic screaming on the floor. Beatrice rapidly pulled the printed pages out, her cold, judgmental eyes rapidly scanning the highlighted text messages Clara had secretly sent to Richard over the past 2 months, regarding my supposed rapid cognitive decline very aggressively. I watched Beatrice read the cruel, manipulative words Clara had written about me, messages laughing about how easily she was tricking the stupid old woman, messages explicitly detailing her aggressive timeline to falsely declare me legally incompetent so she could steal the entire multi-million-dollar estate without any resistance. Messages explicitly bragging that once she secured the power of attorney, she would immediately throw me into a cheap state-run nursing home and never visit me again. Beatrice finished reading the final page, her face twisting into a mask of pure absolute disgust as she looked down at Clara. Beatrice forcefully shoved the printed text messages directly into Richard's chest. He hastily grabbed the papers, his eyes rapidly scanning the undeniable proof of his fiancée's malicious, deeply calculated cruelty and massive financial fraud. As he read the terrible words, the arrogant, entitled anger completely drained from his face, instantly replaced by profound, absolute horror. He realized in that exact moment that the wealthy, sophisticated heiress he thought he was marrying was actually a broke, desperate, highly manipulative criminal who had just publicly humiliated his powerful family in front of their entire elite social and corporate circle forever today, permanently. You forged her signature to steal money for this party? Richard asked, his voice shaking with furious disbelief. He threw the papers onto the floor, staring down at Clara with absolute revulsion. You completely lied to us about your wealth. You tried to forcefully institutionalize your own sister just to steal her retirement funds away. Clara could not even form a coherent response. She just remained on her knees in her expensive designer maternity dress, violently sobbing into her hands, entirely broken. The absolute silence in the massive ballroom was suddenly broken by the harsh voice of Arthur speaking loudly. Arthur stepped forward, his perfectly tailored navy suit completely immaculate, and his face a mask of furious wealthy authority. He looked directly at the event manager, who was still awkwardly holding the declined digital payment terminal. "We are absolutely not paying for this fraudulent event," Arthur stated firmly, entirely washing his hands of the entire catastrophic situation. He looked down at Clara with a cold, terrifying finality. "You are completely finished with my son. You are entirely finished with this family. Do not ever attempt to contact us again, ever." He turned around and immediately began walking toward the grand exit. Beatrice did not say another single word. She simply shot Clara one final look of unmitigated disgust, turned on her expensive heels, and quickly followed her angry husband out of the silent ballroom. Richard stood there for one more agonizing second, looking between his violently sobbing fiancée on the floor and the completely ruined $50,000 party surrounding them. He let out a harsh, disgusted breath, shook his head in absolute disbelief, and walked rapidly away, completely abandoning her in front of the entire crowd. The highly public execution of her fabricated life was absolutely perfect and entirely flawless. The surrounding wealthy guests immediately began filtering out of the grand ballroom, practically running toward the main exit to completely avoid the massive, humiliating fallout. Within exactly 3 minutes, the massive, extravagant room was completely empty, leaving only the confused catering staff, the silent stringed quartet, and Clara violently sobbing on the hardwood floor. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the daughter I had raised. I felt absolutely no pity for her whatsoever today. She had built a massive house of cards using my stolen money and my manufactured pain, and I had just completely incinerated it all forever. I picked up my heavy audit ledger from the silver catering table, carefully clasping the heavy brass buckle of my sensible leather briefcase. I looked down at Clara one last time. "The federal fraud investigators will be arriving at your apartment very shortly," I stated calmly, delivering the final, devastating blow with zero emotional inflection. "My lawyers have already officially filed the massive civil suit for gross identity theft. You will absolutely face felony charges for the forged signatures. You will be completely forced to liquidate every single asset you currently own to repay my stolen funds entirely and immediately." Clara stopped screaming and looked up at me, her face completely ruined by running makeup and massive tears. She looked at me with a desperate, pleading expression, completely reverting to the terrified 5-year-old girl I had comforted after our parents died. "Eleanor, please," she begged, her voice a pathetic, broken whisper. "Please do not do this to me. I am so sorry. I was just so desperate to fit in. Please, you are my mother. You raised me. Please help me fix this terrible mistake now." The sheer audacity of her final manipulation was deeply and profoundly insulting. "I was never your mother," I replied, my voice completely cold and entirely empty. "I was simply the bank you felt entirely entitled to violently rob. A mother would forgive you. An auditor simply balances the absolute final ledgers and firmly demands complete restitution. You are permanently bankrupt, Clara. Socially, financially, and morally. You will spend the next 10 years trying to dig yourself out of the massive hole you maliciously dug for me." I did not wait for her to respond any more. I turned my back on her violently sobbing form and began walking toward the very grand exit. As I walked slowly back through the grand, massive marble foyer, the young hostess in the sharp black uniform immediately stepped out of my way, looking at me with deep, profound respect and absolute terror. I did not look at her. I pushed the heavy frosted glass doors completely open and stepped back out into the freezing, bitter rain. The cold water immediately hit my face, but it felt incredibly refreshing, completely washing away the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the ruined country club. I stood at the top of the grand limestone steps, taking a very deep, calming, long breath. I pulled my sensible beige coat tighter against my body, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of the leather briefcase completely securing my protected financial future. The storm was finally beginning to break, the heavy, dark clouds slowly parting to reveal a faint strip of pale afternoon sunlight hitting the wet asphalt street. I walked slowly down the massive limestone steps, my wet rubber soles squeaking softly against the wet stone. I did not look back at the grand golden windows of the exclusive club. I had absolutely nothing left to see inside that terrible, expensive monument to massive financial fraud. The trap had worked absolutely perfectly, executing my vengeance with a brutal surgical precision that left zero room for any legal or social survival. I had successfully transformed her malicious trap into her absolute undoing, completely exposing the vicious wolf hiding beneath the expensive designer clothing. By playing the pathetic role she had arrogantly written for me, I had allowed her to completely destroy her own life, using her own terrible choices. The forensic accountant inside me felt a deep, profound sense of absolute professional satisfaction as I slowly walked back toward my completely sensible, quietly parked, reliable old sedan. The massive catering bill would remain completely unpaid today, triggering a massive wave of immediate collection calls and aggressive legal actions against her by the wealthy country club board. The Federal Fraud Division would permanently seize her luxury cars, her expensive designer clothes, and absolutely everything she had fraudulently purchased using my stolen money. Richard's powerful family would likely file massive restraining orders against her to protect their precious social reputation from the massive public scandal she had caused intentionally. She was entirely alone, completely penniless, and absolutely facing massive federal prison time for her incredibly arrogant, terrible financial crimes. I unlocked the heavy door of my sensible sedan and slid into the cold driver's seat. I placed my heavy leather briefcase carefully onto the passenger seat, treating it with the immense respect it absolutely deserved. I started the engine, turning the heater on high, letting the warm air slowly chase the freezing dampness from my wet bones. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. The bewildered, terrified old woman was permanently gone. The strong, highly competent, incredibly wealthy senior forensic accountant had returned completely, entirely ready to resume her peaceful, quiet life without any greedy parasites permanently attached. I put the car into gear and slowly drove out of the massive asphalt parking lot, leaving the extravagant, completely ruined baby shower far behind me in the cold rain. The absolute final audit of my vicious sister's fabricated life was officially closed, and the resulting balance was entirely zero. She had arrogant youth, expensive dresses, and a polished, cruel performance. I had infinite patience, massive financial resources, and absolute, undeniable proof. I drove quietly back toward my peaceful suburban home, completely victorious, absolutely secure, and entirely free from the terrible burden of her endless, toxic greed entirely forever today. The days immediately following the country club disaster unfolded with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a corporate liquidation. When a massive fraud is finally exposed to the harsh light of reality, the resulting collapse is never chaotic. It is entirely methodical, driven by the absolute certainty of legal and financial consequences. I did not need to actively participate in the destruction anymore. The heavy machinery of justice, which I had carefully primed and fully loaded during my 2 months of performed weakness, simply took over and began systematically crushing every single aspect of Clara's fabricated life. I watched it happen from the absolute safety of my quiet home. The social execution was the very first thing to occur, and it was breathtakingly swift. Arthur and Beatrice did not simply cancel the wedding. They aggressively erased Clara from their powerful family's history entirely. Within 48 hours of the massive public humiliation in the ballroom, Beatrice personally ensured that every single vendor, from the elite floral designers to the exclusive caterers, knew exactly why the massive event was abruptly canceled. She completely weaponized her vast social network, ensuring Clara was permanently blacklisted from every single high-end establishment, charity gala, and country club in the entire tri-state area. Richard changed his phone number the very next morning. He completely abandoned the expensive luxury apartment they shared, retreating immediately to his parents' heavily guarded estate and leaving Clara entirely alone to face the massive impending legal storm I had unleashed upon her. The financial annihilation followed immediately after. The morning after the baby shower, the heavy legal injunctions David and I had prepared were formally filed with the state court. The frozen ghost account was permanently seized by the bank's internal fraud division. But that was merely the beginning of the absolute financial ruin. Because she had fraudulently used my Social Security number to open the massive credit lines, the banks immediately classified the staggering debt as malicious identity theft. They did not simply close the accounts. They aggressively transferred the massive balances directly to high-pressure corporate collection agencies, placing the entire burden of repayment squarely onto Clara's completely unfunded shoulders. Exactly 3 days later, the federal authorities finally arrived at her apartment. I received a brief, highly professional phone call from David, confirming that the local district attorney, upon reviewing my meticulously compiled audit ledger and the undeniable forged signature cards, had officially decided to press massive felony charges for gross wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Clara was physically arrested in the lobby of her expensive unpaid luxury building. She was forced to surrender her passport, completely eliminating any desperate thoughts she might have harbored about fleeing the country to avoid the massive legal consequences of her incredible arrogance. Facing the terrifying reality of massive federal prison time, her aggressive public defender immediately advised her to begin total financial restitution in a desperate attempt to secure a slightly more lenient plea deal. The resulting forced liquidation of her fake wealthy life was absolute. The leasing company immediately repossessed the luxury sports car Richard had been driving, adding massive early termination penalties to her skyrocketing mountain of debt. She was forcibly evicted from the expensive luxury apartment because the massive monthly rent had been entirely subsidized by the stolen funds I had now completely cut off. She was forced to sell absolutely everything just to pay back a tiny fraction of what she had maliciously stolen. The expensive vintage wines, the ridiculous designer clothing, the massive diamond tennis bracelet she had proudly worn while cruelly banishing me to the freezing rain. All of it was aggressively seized and sold at a fraction of its original value by a court-appointed liquidator. The boutique interior design firm I had originally funded with entirely clean money completely collapsed, buried under the massive weight of her destroyed reputation and her sudden inability to secure even a basic line of commercial credit. She was reduced to absolutely nothing, exactly as she deserved. Exactly 3 weeks after the baby shower, my cell phone rang. I was sitting in my quiet home office, comfortably reviewing the completely stabilized and highly secure ledgers of the Primary Family Trust. I looked at the caller ID. It was Clara, calling from an unrecognized cheap prepaid cell phone. For a brief second, the deeply ingrained maternal instinct I had harbored for 30 years flickered, a phantom pain in a severed limb. But the seasoned forensic accountant instantly shut it down. I picked up the phone, ensuring my voice was completely devoid of any emotional warmth, and answered with a sharp professional greeting. "Eleanor, please don't hang up," she begged immediately. Her voice was completely ragged, completely stripped of the arrogant, condescending tone she had weaponized against me for months. She sounded incredibly small, entirely defeated, and desperately terrified. "I have absolutely nothing left. They took the apartment. They took the business. I am staying in a cheap motel by the highway, and I cannot even afford to buy basic groceries. The federal lawyers are talking about massive prison time. Please, you have to tell them to drop the massive civil lawsuit. You have to tell them it was all just a terrible misunderstanding." I listened to her desperate pleading while looking directly at my pristine digital computer screen. The numbers on the screen represented the absolute safety and profound security she had actively tried to maliciously destroy. "It was not a misunderstanding, Clara," I stated calmly, my voice perfectly steady and entirely cold. "It was a highly calculated, deeply malicious, felony financial fraud. You spent an entire year aggressively gaslighting me, trying to forcefully institutionalize me just so you could steal my entire life savings to impress a man who completely abandoned you the very second the stolen money stopped flowing." She began to violently sob into the cheap receiver, the ugly, desperate sounds of a predator finally caught in a massive trap. I know," she cried frantically. "I was incredibly stupid. I was completely blinded by the money and the wealthy lifestyle. But please, I am still your sister. You raised me. You practically birthed me. You are the only mother I have ever known. Please, look at all the years we had together. You cannot just let me go to a federal prison. Please, Eleanor, you have to save me. My baby needs its family. Please." She was actively attempting to weaponize the very last piece of emotional leverage she possessed: the deep, historical, maternal bond and the innocent unborn child. It was the exact same manipulative tactic she had used to force my compliance when she first announced the pregnancy. But the tactic was completely useless now. The woman who would have sacrificed absolutely everything to save her was permanently dead, entirely murdered by Clara's own vicious, calculating greed. I leaned back in my heavy leather desk chair, feeling entirely unmoved by her massive, theatrical display of desperate sorrow. "You actively chose to permanently destroy our family the exact moment you forged my signature to steal that very first dollar," I replied politely but incredibly firmly, cementing the absolute final boundary between us. "You looked at my lifelong devotion, and you only saw weakness. You looked at my age, and you completely assumed I was stupid. You are no longer my sister, Clara. You are simply a hostile thief who completely failed to rob a highly secure bank. The resulting massive consequences are entirely yours to manage alone." "But what am I supposed to do?" she screamed into the phone, her voice cracking with absolute raw panic. "I am completely bankrupt. I have absolutely zero money and a massive felony record. How am I supposed to survive? I highly suggest you find a very sensible, practical job," I answered smoothly, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy whatsoever. "And perhaps you should learn to budget properly. Good luck with the federal sentencing." I ended the call immediately. I did not wait to hear her scream or beg again. I firmly pressed the block button on the unrecognized number, completely and permanently severing the very last tiny thread of communication linking us together. The profound silence that instantly filled my quiet home office was not heavy or sad. It was incredibly light, completely peaceful, and absolutely perfect. The massive, draining parasite had been permanently removed from my life. The final audit was completely finished, the ledgers were perfectly balanced, and the massive debt had been entirely settled by her absolute ruin. The heavy, chaotic storm of the past year has completely passed, leaving behind a profound and absolute quiet in my home. I am sitting on my glass-enclosed sun porch, the warm afternoon light spilling across the clean hardwood floor. The frantic energy of lawyers, the stressful banking audits, and the exhausting performance of my supposed cognitive decline are entirely gone. My financial portfolio is permanently secured behind impenetrable legal trusts, entirely safe from any further predatory attacks. I am drinking a simple cup of hot black tea, enjoying the immense luxurious peace that only comes when you finally remove a deeply toxic element from your life permanently. Resting neatly folded on the wicker chair directly beside me is the heirloom cashmere baby blanket. It is still wrapped in its pristine protective plastic, entirely untouched by the freezing rain or the massive destruction of that terrible afternoon at the country club. I did not throw it away, and I certainly did not give it to Clara. I kept it exactly as it is, a beautiful, innocent symbol of the deep love I am still fully capable of giving. It sits there patiently waiting, safely preserved for a future family member, perhaps a distant cousin or a chosen friend's child, someone who will actually appreciate the profound legacy and the quiet devotion stitched into every single ivory lattice square. Looking back on the absolute devastation I unleashed upon my sister, I do not feel a single ounce of regret. I gave her 30 years of unconditional love, massive financial support, and infinite patience. And she maliciously attempted to weaponize my age to steal my entire future. I speak directly to you now, looking right into the camera, because I know there are thousands of older men and women watching this who are currently suffering in total silence. You are dealing with entitled children or arrogant in-laws who are actively trying to convince you that your mind is failing simply so they can gain unchecked access to your hard-earned bank accounts. Hear me clearly. A wolf in sheep's clothing still has teeth, but an old watchdog absolutely never loses her bite. Never, ever mistake a senior's deliberate silence for helpless ignorance, because the quietest players at the table always hold the winning hand. We have survived decades of complex challenges. We do not suddenly become foolish just because our hair turns gray. Do not let them gaslight you into surrendering your absolute independence. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue building this strong community of survivors. More importantly, go down to the comment section right now and share your thoughts. Tell me you agree that standing up to vicious family abuse is absolutely always the right choice, no matter how difficult the initial confrontation might be. Your voice matters, your experience is entirely valid, and you are absolutely never alone in this fight.